All right, we're live. Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much. Thank you for joining me in this session. Um, as always, I'm so honored to be here with you in this time of sensitivity and uncertainty, and I look forward to sharing time with you in our shared sacred space together today. So the things we'll do today in our shared sacred space for this month is number one, we will set our sacred space right at the beginning, and then we will talk about our topic for this month. And our topic for this session will be healing grief, and more specifically, the role of vision in the process of healing grief. We'll have a bit of an exercise after that, and then we'll close our sacred space. Okay. And in starting the process of setting our sacred space together now, I'll start by saying that what we want to do here in this space is that we would like to create a space that is devoid of fear, threat, and control in order for us to be able to open to higher guidance from within our own selves, however we define that. It could be a muse that guides us and inspires us. It could be flashes of intuition, random insights that come to us, in the shower or on a long run or something like that. However we define that, we want to be in the space that is devoid of fear, threat, and control, so that we can be open and more receptive to these downloads that we get from wherever we feel we get them from. A safe sanctuary space for us all to relax and surrender with no feeling of danger or threat, so that we can partake of the nourishment, the emotional nourishment and the spiritual nourishment that comes from being in sacred space together as a group. And in opening our sacred space today, I will propose, as I do every session, that we all follow the 4 principles of Presidian sacred space. Number one, confidentiality, standard Vegas rules. What happens in sacred space stays in sacred space. Now, that's the rule for when we gather in person around the world. And thankfully, we're going to be starting to do that again in just the next couple weeks in Paris and in Athens. But here for online, because the stream is public, because the replay is public, the way we do confidentiality is via anonymization. So if you would like to be anonymous, you don't have to be anonymous. But if for any reason you would like to be anonymous, you would come into the Crowdcast stream, go into edit profile, and change your username to Harry Potter, Mickey Mouse, whatever you would like. And then come back in and continue chatting, asking questions anonymously, as you would like, only if you want. The second principle is that as much as possible, right, we're all human, we're all fallible, but as much as possible, we try our best to refrain from giving any kind of feeling of threat, of controlling, regardless of intention. So not just hostile threat, but well-meaning threat. In other words, you better do this if you want to feel better, right? And you better do this or else. So that's a well-meaning threat. We refrain from that as well, right? So there's no fixing, there's no interventions, there's no tough love in sacred space. There's nothing wrong with those things, but because those, work the levers of fear, threat, and control, albeit for a good purpose, right, or a well-meaning purpose, that dissolves the magic and the physics of the sacred space, which is simply defined as being devoid of fear, threat, and control. Right? So here we hold space for each other to be however you happen to find yourself. Right? So if you're afraid and anxious, we just hold space for you to be afraid and anxious. If you're happy and relaxed, we hold space for you to be happy and relaxed. If you're not sure how you're feeling and you're just kind of all over the place, we hold space for you to be all over the place. Okay. The third principle is a corollary of the first two, and that is that there is no commerce that is transacted or solicited in sacred space. Right. So, and that applies to everyone, myself included. So I cannot sell you anything. Gary, my editor, when she comes on screen, cannot sell you anything. Please refrain from pitching things to each other in the chat. And this goes not just for things that are solicited for money, but also recommended or suggested, right? So even if there's a great book that would really help that issue you're having over there, and I'm not being compensated, it's just a book that I love, I will refrain from making that recommendation also, because that is a kind of threat in a sense, where it's like, oh, I have just the thing that will fix that right up. And the implied threat is I don't benefit either way. I don't care, right? But if you don't do this, if you don't read this book, if you don't look into it, you feel like you might miss out, right? So again, nothing wrong with that, right? There's nothing wrong with a little FOMO here or there. We all feel it. But in sacred space specifically, we try to release and step away from all that. Because there's certain things you can only get done in sacred space. So that's why we create the space for, a sort of couple hours every month. So we can kind of go to the bank, go to the airport, get our things done that we can only get done in those specific kinds of spaces. And here, no commerce, no recommendations. We are here for your energy, not for the things you bring. We are here for what you are, not for what you do or provide. And the fourth principle is, again, a corollary. There's no expectation of participation, right? So there's no pressure to do anything, no fear, threat, or control, right? So there's no expectation that you will chat, that you will ask questions, that you will stay for the duration of the sacred space. You can come and go as you please. There's no expectation that you'll invite friends. There's just no pressure to do anything, again, because we're trying to step away from the physics levels of fear, threat, and control. Because the nourishment comes from the held space and your presence and attention, from what you are, not from what you do or provide. And in shared sacred space, all of us together will tend to amplify that effect, right? So anyway, this is what I propose. And if you are not okay with creating this space together, that's totally okay. There's no fear, threat, or control for you to stay in this space, right? But that's the threshold we are about to cross. And so we want to take a pause now and give everyone a moment to withdraw from the group if you would like. And that's totally okay. We'll still be friends, right? We'll hang out in the sort of non-sacred space later on. But we wanted to give you a moment to take your time and make your selection either way. Okay. Okay. All right. And so then for the rest of us, we will now move forward together into our shared sacred space. And as we cross the threshold now into our shared sacred space, I will just remind everyone, myself included, that we are now in a space where we are, to the best of our ability, observing the four principles of sacred space: confidentiality / anonymization, no fear, threat, or control, no fixing, no tough love, no interventions, no commerce, no recommendations, and no expectation of participation. All right, welcome back to our shared sacred space for the month of April 2022. And our topic for the session today is healing grief and the role of vision. So in this month's kind of mythic fairy tale brainstorm call that I had with Gary, we came across a Spanish folktale from the Catalan tradition, which seemed to continue the arc we have followed in the past 2 months, right? And then in the past 2 months, we've talked about the theme of self-sabotage, right? How it happens within you, how not to do it. And in this session, the sort of golden thread of the muse kind of like leading us along for each of these sessions seemed to lead us into an insight into the role of vision in the process of how to heal grief. And so, Gary, if you're on screen, do you want to come on? And I'd love for you to tell us about the story that you've selected for this session. Hi, Gary.
Hi, Artie. Hi.
Thank you for coming back.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. Okay, let me find the story that I chose for this session. So yeah, like I said, it's a Catalan story. It seems so familiar because, as we discussed it, I realized we have done something similar before, but it's just that the details are kind of slightly skewed in a different angle. Like it's almost like you take a few symbols and you look at them through like a prism or something, and you turn the prism around, and from every angle you get to see a different aspect of the same set of symbols.
I love that.
So this story felt like, we've seen all of these symbols before, but we're just looking at them from a different angle. So how does that go, and what are the dynamics of this set of events happening in this way when we look at it from a different angle? So that was interesting for me. You will see. I mean, if there are people who are following, Sacred Space for the last couple of years, it will seem very, very familiar. Like, yeah, we've seen this scene before. This has happened before. So
Totally.
and like I said, now I'm becoming more and more aware of the dreamlike quality of these stories for me inside Sacred Space. And when I encounter these stories and I say, okay, this feels like a dream I've had before. And I think people with us in Sacred Space will also start seeing that, because there's a feeling of deja vu. Like, I've seen this has happened. I know where this is going. And I think I kind of know what the story is telling me, but just that the perspective is different. So I love the feeling I'm getting in reading these stories now.
I really love that. Thank you for saying that. It makes me just want to say a little something about the nature of archetype and how archetype kind of reveals itself to us and yields over time to our respectful inquiry and curiosity. And that's this idea of the crystal, of like turning around and looking at it from different angles. There's this kind of abiding question of, gosh, these are stories from the Catalan tradition, from the Indian tradition, from the Japanese tradition, Chinese folktales, West African, East African folktales, Northern European, First Nations, Native American folktales. And it's not something we've been trying to do as a thesis in this series, but I mean, it's just what happens, right? You read stories in a consistent way, mythopoetically, across all of these traditions, and you come up with some very consistent themes, right? And the classic, what is it? I don't know if it's history of religions or sociological or anthropological kind of debate is, have these ideas diffused from a central source, right, through tribal history, migrations, and humans going around, or is something else responsible for the consistency of these images and physics, inner physics, across humanity? And you could say it's a bit of both, right? But for me, it really speaks to the power of archetype, where consistent physics show up not because they've been passed hand to hand over millennia necessarily, but because there's something about the physics we're discovering here that is common to all of us as, well, let's just say as humans for now, right? So in other words, if you see all these birds all over the planet and they all have beaks and they all build nests, right, and they all sing to each other, you can say, was this through diffusion, or is this something intrinsic to the nature of birds, right? And I would say a lot of this is intrinsic to the nature of birds. You don't need to go around and say, well, who taught you how to build a nest? That's like, it just comes out of my biology. I don't know, right? Similarly, when we identify a well, or when we the a mountain, and there's a king and the queen, and symbols of our own inner masculine, inner feminine. The beauty of reading these different stories across cultures is that we get to understand these patterns and archetypes within our own selves in a deeper and more nuanced way. So in the Catalan story, some themes will be very familiar, but the accent is on a different symbol. Like I was drawn to a different symbol in the story versus like a traditional Grimm Brothers story. And when the story takes a twist or a turn where you're like, huh, I haven't seen that before, but everything else is the same, right? It then gives you deeper insight into the deeper physics of that same archetype. And sort of the extra credit advanced thing is that there's the store of myth and fairy tale that you have access to that we are all building upon in a series like this. Right. But then on top of that, you build all of the dreams you're recording, if you record your dreams, and reading those mythopoetically as well. They're just as valid as any of these stories, your dreams. And then on top of that is the kind of selective, curated memory of all the things that happen in your outer world in the regular, for real waking world. Right? But these dream worlds are just as real. Where you will remember certain interactions, from 10 years ago, more clearly and vividly and significantly than you will remember an interaction from yesterday, earlier, right? And there is a reason for that. Right? These instances, things that happen that make you go, whoa. The natural sort of reflex of the profane is to say, oh, whatever, it's just a coincidence, go and keep. And you can just carry on with, all the livelong day. But if you stop and say, no, this particular episode with this particular person, for no good reason, I don't even know why, I will choose now, as the sovereign creative of my life, to read this as a dream, as a fairy tale, and what will it yield to me, right? So I just love that you're pulling from different traditions, and we're finding themes and physics that are consistent and things that don't really fit, which pique our interest even more. And I love that we're like seeing how this blends into your dream life as well, and then your real life as well. So anyway, that's just a moment.
And what you said made me think. I think all of this that you mentioned about archetypes and these ancient stories also speaks to the point that stories themselves are an archetype. In the way that everything that we communicate or understand and perceive from the outside world, and everything that we say to the world is a story.
Yes.
Right. And and that's how we make sense of everything. I mean, that's just the way humans make sense of everything.
Yeah.
And everything is a narrative, right? How something is presented to us, maybe, in the news is a narrative. Right. How we make sense of it is a narrative. And what we tell ourselves, right, our inner talk is narrative.
Yeah.
And so, the story, the way it appears to us itself is like an archetype. And so it makes sense that dreams and these ancient traditions of telling symbolic stories in the form of myths is just expressing ourselves in that archetype, because this archetype is so predominant in everything that we say and do. So it makes sense to me that this is how we gain wisdom and insight as well. The story is the way wisdom and insight comes to us from the muse and from our ancestors and from our guides.
And just one thing to add here is that so these things are all archetypes. Totally agree. Narrative is archetype. Your narrative about what is the nature of reality, you could say, well, it's all just science and everything started with the Big Bang. We can prove these things. And that is a narrative. I'm not saying something is a narrative doesn't mean to say it's wrong, right?
Yeah.
But it is a self-contained narrative. And with any narrative, you can poke at it, right? I can say, well, then what happened before the Big Bang? And it's like, well, you don't know, right? And so I think the even more exciting part of this for me is this in our practice in doing preside, right? When we talk about things like archetypal manifestation, this idea that you can actually choose your narrative, right? You can actually choose your narrative as the sovereign creator of your life. And if you're like, well, I'm just a victim and the world is pushing me around and I'm this poor little sort of sod and, you know, I have no power. It's like, that's okay. There's nothing wrong with thinking that. That is a narrative.
Yeah.
Right. That is a narrative. It can be changed. The mechanisms, the craft, the art of how to change that narrative is endlessly like fascinating to me, at least. And it may be, you know, it's like if I'm sort of in this mess of, you know, sort of the narratives and archetypes of my life, I may not have enough craft to paint myself out of this scene, right? And that's okay. You don't shame people for not being like Picasso in terms of, you know, artists of their life. But whether it's impossible for someone to do that always remains to be seen. Right? I mean, even the thing of like, I absolutely don't have the narrative craft to get myself out of this life situation is itself
Is
a
a
narrative.
narrative.
So you can always get in there and say, well, you know, I mean, why don't you try this? Why don't you try that?
Yeah.
And it becomes very, very exciting.
Yeah.
There's this line from Goethe that always comes to me. In the German, I'm not a German speaker, so forgive my accent, but it was a quote that so moved me. I tried to memorize the German, and in the German, I believe it is alles Vergangliche ist nur ein Gleichnis, which basically translates into all things that are transient, impermanent, are but metaphors. And of course, everything is transient and impermanent. The universe will end at some point, right? The earth will end at some point. And this grand sort of vision, this narrative, right? That everything we see in the phenomenal world is but a metaphor. A metaphor of what? It is a reflection of the underlying archetype.
Yeah.
Right. Which is why nests and eggs pop up spontaneously for, you know, inexplicable reasons all over the planet where you find birds. And, you know, inner conflicts of inner masculine and inner feminine projected out into the outer world of relationship, right? Show up everywhere you find humans. It's all sort of, you know, a metaphor of a deeper layer of physics, if you will. And that is the layer of archetype.
Yeah, thank you. So do you want me to go ahead and start the story?
Yes, we should probably do that.
Thank you. Right, so this story is called The Water of Life. And that was one of the things that really piqued my interest, because we've been talking about that particular symbol in the last 2 sessions as well. And we'll come to that when Artie shares his notes and thoughts about it. So the story is called The Water of Life. And it's about 3 brothers and a sister who live together in a small cottage. And you know, they lived happily, they loved one another dearly. And one day, the eldest brother, who'd apparently never done anything but, you know, have fun from sunrise to sunset, said to, you know, his brothers and sister, you know, let's all work hard and perhaps we shall grow rich and we should be able to build ourselves a palace. And to this, his brothers and sister, answered joyfully and said, yes, 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 let's all work. And so they fell to working with all their energy, all their strength, till at last they became rich. And they were able to build themselves a beautiful palace, and everyone came to see this beautiful place, this wonder, and how splendid this place was. And everyone turned up to see the palace. No one even thought of picking faults with it. Everything was just so perfect. Till an old woman who had been walking through the rooms and with a crowd of people suddenly said, well, yes, this is a splendid palace, but there's something it needs. And the siblings were curious, so they said, and what may that be? And the old woman said, it needs a church. So when they heard this, the brother said, all right, if that's what it needs to make this perfect, let's do it. So they set to work again to earn some more money. And when they had enough, they set about building a church, which they wanted to be just as large and just as beautiful as the palace itself. And after the church was finished, even greater number of people came. And they all flocked to see the palace and the church and the gardens and the magnificent halls. But then, as they were, serving their guests and showing them around, an old man turned to them and said, well, yes, this is all most beautiful, but there is still something it needs. And they went again, and what may that be? Well, a pitcher of the water of life, a branch of the tree of eternal beauty, and the talking bird. So now, who's ever heard of them? So the siblings go, where are we to find these things? And the old man had the answer ready. He said, well, go to the mountain, which is far off from here, and you will find what you seek. And so after the old man had, bowed politely, said goodbye to them, the eldest brother said, okay, I think I will go in search of the water of life and the talking bird and the tree of beauty. So it's time. And then the sister said, but suppose some evil thing befalls you. How shall we know? Right? And he said, oh, you're right. I not thought of that. And so he went back and followed the old man, went back to him and said, we wish to do this. We wish to go and seek for the water of life and the tree of beauty and the talking bird. And you said we need all this to make the palace perfect. But how shall we know if anything evil happens to me? How will my siblings know? So the old man took out a knife. He had a knife with him, and he gave it to the siblings, and he said, all right, keep this carefully. And as long as the blade is bright, all is fine. But if the blade turns bloody, then you know that evil has befallen him. So the brothers thanked him, and they left, went straight back to the palace, and the eldest brother started to get ready to set out for the mountain. And as he walked and he walked and he walked, and he went a long way, and he met a giant. So finally he found someone he could ask, and he said, can you tell me how much further I have to go before I've reached this mountain? And the giant asked him, but why do you wish to go there? And the brother said, well, I'm seeking this, the water of life, the talking bird, and the tree of beauty. I need these treasures for my palace. And the giant said, well, many people have passed seeking exactly those treasures, but no one has ever come back. And you won't ever come back either, unless you pay attention to my words, right? So follow this path, and when you reach the mountain, you will find it covered with stones, right? Do not stop to look at them, but keep going, keep on your way. And as you go, you will hear scoffs and laughs and jeers and all of that behind you. it will be the stones that mock you. Do not heed them. And above all, do not turn around. And if you do, you will become one of them. And walk straight on till you get to the top. Then take all you wish for and then come back. So the young man thanked him for this advice, and he walked and walked and walked until he reached the mountain. And as he climbed, he heard behind him, just as the giant said, scoffs and jeers and laughs. But he kept his ears steadily closed to them. And at last, the noise was so loud that he lost patience. So he stooped to pick up a stone to hurl into the clamor itself, to shut them up. He realized that his arm started to stiffen. In the next moment, he became a stone himself. And that day, his sister back at home, who thought that, her brother had been away for too long, took out the knife and found that the blade had turned blood red. And so she cried out to her brothers, something terrible has happened to our brother. This is what I saw. I saw the blade turn red. And the second brother said, all right, I will go and find him. And so he went. And the exact same thing happened, right? So he walked a long way. He found the giant, asked the giant about the mountain. The giant gave him the exact same advice, right? He said, I've seen your brother pass, but I've not seen him come back. So the spell must have worked on him. And the younger brother said, all right, so what can I do to disenchant him and find these treasures? And the giant gave him the exact same advice. Right? Follow the path. Don't look at the stones. Don't listen to them. Keep steadily on. Look at the mountain, and you will reach there. So that was his advice. Right? He gave the same thing. And the second brother thanked him for his advice and set out for the mountain. And he avoided, turning around and looking at the stones. He heard all the jokes and the jibes and the laughing and the mocking. And it almost deafened him. And he let them carry on for some time. He pushed forward boldly till he passed the place where his brother had turned into stone. And at that moment, he heard the laughter and the wail and the sounds. And he heard his brother's voice. And that made him stop and look back. And so there was another stone that got added to the number. Right? And meanwhile, the sister left at home. She was counting the days. And now 2 brothers had gone, and it had been so long for them to return. So she took the knife out and looked at the blade. And again, and she had polished it and kept it back in its place, but now it had turned blood red again. Right? So now she was anxious and she was horrified. She called the youngest brother to her. She showed the knife to him. And he said, don't worry, I will go. Right? And the same thing happened. He walked all the way till he found the giant. And he asked the giant, have you seen 2 young men making for the mountain? And the giant told him, yes, they passed by. They didn't come back. So I know that they have fallen under the spell. And so what must I do? And I need all those treasures. So he gets the same advice from the giant. And then he follows the same path. He reaches the mountain. He hears all those voices, does not pay attention to them. And then he heard his brother's voices. And that's it. He turned around because he was just so surprised to hear their voices. And there was one more stone added to the number, right? So now all the 3 brothers have turned into stones. And all this while, the sister is worried and she's pacing up and down the palace. And this time she has the knife in her hand. She won't let go of it, dreading that she might see it turn red. And that's just what happens. The blade turns red before her eyes. And she says, okay, so now it is my turn. And then she walked and walked and walked till she came to the giant. And she prayed to him to tell her if he had seen 3 young men pass in that direction. And he told her the same thing, right? And he said, you must go to that mountain and you'll find all these stones. Don't listen to them. Don't listen to the voices. Keep climbing and just focus on the mountain. And the girl thanked him for his advice. She set out for the mountain, and she'd gone only a few steps upwards, and she started hearing these cries and screams and laughter all around her. And she felt as if each stone that she stepped on was a living thing. But she remembered the words of the giant. And she didn't know what had happened to her brothers, but she kept her face steadily towards the mountaintop. And the mountaintop kept growing nearer and nearer every moment. But then the clamor, the sounds just kept growing louder and louder. And the highest above them all of these voices were her brothers' voices. But the girl paid no attention to that. And she kept going. And finally, she stood on the top of the mountain. And then she looked around. She saw, lying in a hollow, there's this pool of the water of life. And she took a pitcher that she had brought with her. She filled it to the brim. And then just by the pool was the tree of beauty and the talking bird on one of its branches. So she caught the bird, put it in a cage, broke off one of the branches, and then she turned back to go. And she went joyfully down the hill. She got all the treasures. She'd finally made it to the top of the mountain. And even though all of that long climb had tired her out and the pitcher was really heavy, she had got these treasures, right? And now the pitcher was full. It was overflowing. So as she walked, a few drops of the water fell on the stones. And as soon as the water touched them, the stones changed back into young men and women. And they all surrounded her to thank her for their deliverance. So this is how she learned. She realized, so if the evil spell has to be broken, I have to sprinkle water on the stones. And so she carefully sprinkled every stone there till not a single stone was left. And then there was this whole big company of young men and women who followed her down the mountain, including, her brothers. And when they all arrived at the palace, she didn't lose a mountain in planting the branch of tree of beauty and watering it with the water of life. And the branch shot up into a tree. It was heavy with flowers, and the talking bird happily nestled in the branches. Now, the fame of these wonders, went far and wide. Everyone around heard about this. The people flocked in great numbers to see these marvels. And the young woman who had managed to do all this. Right, and along came the king's son, the prince, who was equally curious. And he wanted to see everything, the palace, the church, the gardens, and all of these wonders. And he admired the beauty and the strangeness and how exotic everything was. But more than that, he admired the beauty and courage of the young woman who made all of this happen. And so he went home and told his parents and gained their consent to marry her. And, the wedding was celebrated in the church next to the palace. And then, the prince and the princess and then going ahead, the king and queen lived happily ever after. So that's the story. Artie, would you like to come back on?
That was wonderful.
Hi.
Hi. I liked it even better the second time. Thank you.
Thank you.
So let me start with my usual question.
Mm-hmm.
Where did you enter into that story? Where did that story strike you the most?
So while I was discussing this with you and also thought about the story for a while, I remembered that we'd done similar stories before, right? But when I read the story, the first thing that actually came to me, and it seemed absurd, and I couldn't see the connection. But the thought that came to me was, this is a follow-up from the 2 previous stories that we've done, which is the story of Kuda, and her magic drums, the African story where we talked about the mechanics of self-sabotage, right? I can link that up, for everyone, if that would help. So that was one story, and the follow-up to that, as we realized, was the Japanese story that we read last month, where this old man finds this fountain of sake, the spiritual kind of fountain, in the middle of the forest, up a mountain, which he finds thanks to the monkey that he treats with compassion, right? So there are these stories, and they all had a very different flavor.
Totally different cultures.
Totally different cultures as well. And then I read this story, and the thing that comes to me is, this is a follow-up. And I'm like, how? And I had forgotten to tell you this happened. I read the story without even looking at the title. So I was just flipping through the pages of this book, and I was reading stories after stories to see what clicks for me. And I read this story fully, and I hadn't even seen the title. And when this thing came to me that this is a follow-up, I went back to see the title, and it said Water of Life.
Right.
It just came to me. Okay, Water of Life. So we have Kuda, who goes into the pool of water in the middle of the forest, taking the children
Which we
with her.
identified as grief, as the pool of grief, as the pool of tears, really.
Pool of tears, right? And then we have the sake fountain, which is central to what happens to the old man, right? How he finds it.
It is the elixir that changes everything.
Changes everything. So it's central to that story. So we have the sake fountain. And then we have this story, which is all about the pitcher of the water of life. So that's what struck me the most about the story. But as we discussed it, there are so many other symbols that I remember that we'd covered before in different stories. But I'll come to that later once you share your thoughts. But yeah, so that's really what intrigued me. There was clearly kind of a message that came through that this is a follow-up. We've talked about self-sabotage. We've talked about compassion towards our own inner selves. We've talked about how just listening to these various parts of our inner selves and tending to our own wounds with compassion is what leads us to this elixir of life, right? So then here we are with this story. So would you like to share your thoughts on that?
Definitely. So I think just to start off, for everyone who may be joining, especially if this is your first session. So when we read these stories, we read them mythopoetically. And what that means is that we regard all of the characters, all the sort of major actors in the story, as being symbols of different parts of your own inner self. So, in other words, the brothers are a part of you. The sister is a symbol of a part of you. The old man, the old crone, the giant, the stones, the tree, the bird, the water of life, they are all symbols of different parts of you. Okay. And so then when we read these stories, then we start in the beginning, and we have this entire cast of characters. We hit play on the video. We let the action unspool. Okay. And then we make notes on who's doing what to whom, what's going on, who is succeeding, who is not succeeding. And it's not, me versus somebody else. These are all parts of me, right? So the brothers, the sisters, the old man, et cetera, et cetera. You could say, these are like my heart, liver, and lungs, right? We want all of them to succeed because without any of these, I'm in trouble. So you want to see where they have conflict, and you want to see in cases where a certain character does really well at the end, what happened there, and then you take clues from all of that for your own life journey. Okay. And so here, I just want to make this sort of larger point around the symbol of water and the mechanics of this. Because this is sort of a follow-up to the last two sessions, we could spend days talking about like the symbolism of water, how it's treated differently in the Kuda story, how it's treated differently in the Sake story, and how it's treated differently here. But the main thing I want to say is that water, when you see it in a dream, a myth, a fairy tale, is symbolic of a number of things. One of them is that it is the realm of insight. It is the realm of insight. So when you see the ocean in dreams, right, it is the realm of sort of your own deep, unfathomable emotional depths from which insights, whales, orcas, salmon, right? And these are all, I'm referring to all these different Jonah and the whale, the salmon of a wisdom of Celtic tradition. Even in the Catholic tradition, right, the Pope wears a hat, right, which is the Pope's mitre is notched at the top because it's a salmon head. The Pope wears a ring called the fisherman's ring. So basically, long story short, water is symbolic of your own sort of unfathomable depths. And the insights are the fish and other things that come out of this. So in a dream, when you're looking at water and you're afraid to go in and you see sharks in the water or shadowy things, you're afraid of the insights that are lurking beneath the surface and you go away. When you're on the beach, you're at the edge of the realm of insight within you. And you go in, does a whale come up and take you down into grief, into the pool of grief? Does Kuda like bring all of your future potential, your children, into the well of grief, not irrevocably and not as a punishment, as we said in that story 2 months ago, but basically as a next phase of your life process and just waiting for you to sort of kind of get the memo to realize you need to go in after them because they're still there. They're not dead. You can still hear the drum even today, right, beating. The sake fountain story, we got insights into the physics of the straight shot of how you find this pool of magical elixir within you, how you can be led into it, what the limits are, right? You don't use it for the profane to just sort of make a lot of money necessarily, but you get just enough for you to express your your bliss and true purpose in life. Okay. And so here, what's really interesting is that the water of life is kind of up on the mountain. There's some action around it. But here, the focus of the story, the accent of the story, is really around the process of ascension, of how you get to the water, right? And in the last story, you can say, well, you're nice to the monkey, you treat the kids right, and you go. And here we have a completely different sort of set of initial sort of conditions, right? Where there is no issue. The four siblings are doing just fine. They're building a castle. They're building a church. And then this is sort of like the next level of what they want to do. And they're not in hardship. They're not being threatened. A dragon didn't come and like burn down their castle, right? They don't need to do any of this. It is from their own choice and through inspiration that they're doing this. But even so, they end up getting into trouble when they reach, not too far, but they reach toward that next level. Whereas with Kuda and the sort of sake story, you're starting from hardship. Here it's more, everything's fine and I want to go even further, which is a beautiful kind of place to be. Okay. So in other words, not forced into circumambulation of the ups and downs, 2 steps forward, 1 step back of the path of life, as we've talked about in many previous sessions. Gary, you might put up the session on the labyrinth as well. Circumambulation of the labyrinth from eons ago, just as a reference. And so here, the reason I'm saying all of this is that when you have a series of stories like this, myths and fairy tale that present themselves to you spontaneously out of nowhere for no good reason, it is exactly the same as when you have a series of dreams, uh, all out of nowhere for no good reason, and you happen to remember them all as well. Okay. And that is this, that each dream fairy tale episode in real life is zooming in on a particular part of the labyrinthine path of your life and trying to give you a clue to that specific part that it's zoomed into. Okay. In other words, at a high level, I could say, well, it's circumambulatory, 2 steps forward, 1 step back, whatever happens, it's fine. It's part of the overall pattern. That's all well and good. That insight alone may be helpful. But when we get into these specific dreams and fairy tales, it's like, okay, your muse, your counterpart on the other side, however wherever you get your higher guidance from, they're giving you detailed turn-by-turn GPS guidance and instruction, right? It's not just love and light overall wellness, right? The other side, the sort of forces that love you, that are trying to sort of promote you and help you win, your ancestors, your muse, whatever you like to call them, on the other side of the veil, to the extent that you are open and willing and curious and paying attention, they will not just give you the platitudinal love and light guidance. They will give you turn by turn, this guy, no, that person, maybe, and here's why. Okay. And you see this very specifically in this series of dreams that fairy tales that Gary is presenting to us here as well. So there is the overall role of water and the importance of water. That's great. But there are a number of different angles of like, okay, how do you get to the water? What are the things that can happen when you try to go for the water? And specific guidance on how to get through it. Okay. And so to me, this story is zooming into the mechanics of how you get to the water successfully, unlike the Kuta story, right, where the women of the field didn't make it, but not exactly in a perfect straight shot. So the Kuta story was like, this is how not to do it. The Sake old man story was like, this is how to do it in a perfect world. And then this story is like, okay, typically there's going to be bumps on the road. Here's a zoom in on one specific case study of the types of bumps that can happen. So here we start off with a foursome, right? The self is a quaternity. And this foursome is lopsided on the masculine side because you would expect 2 brothers, 2 sisters, or a mom and a dad and a son and a daughter. This is not speaking about sort of gender politics in the outside world. This is within our own inner selves. And we're talking about the inner, not male, but the inner masculine principle within you and the inner feminine principle within you, okay, regardless of your outer declared gender. And I speak exhaustively about the nature of inner masculine and feminine in other sessions. I won't do that again here too. So here there's 3 brothers and 1 sister. That's the imbalance, right? So right off you see this is a story about how probably we will recover the rest of the missing inner feminine, right? And bring the 3 to 1 back into balance of 2 to 2. And so what's nice here is that there's also this progression of like spontaneously, this albeit lopsided sort of self, more masculinely accented and inclined, right? So boundary protection and manifestation, right? The functions of the masculine. They're like, you know what? We should build a castle. Like zoop, zoop, castle is built. Right? I love that. Just like 3 to 1 concentration ratio of masculine and feminine. So the stuff is getting done. But then it is the old crone, right? And this is sort of like the witch of the Hansel and Gretel story in a way that mirrors the dead original mother, the stepmother, and Gretel herself. So here there's only one sister in the sort of four siblings. So the next one to come in is the crone, which says, this is great, but we need a church as well. And they build a church that is equal to the castle, which is fascinating. So on the guidance of the feminine, right, in the world they build, right, you could say, this isn't exactly, but you could say the masculine is the castle, right, power, boundaries, et cetera, et cetera. And the feminine is the church, which is sort of the womb, the sacred space where you get the download from, the goddess, and inspiration and vision and purpose of your life. And in this story, it starts off 3-1, and then in the building of the church and the castle, they are 1-1. They are equal in size. Okay. So that's very interesting to me reading this, because I'm like, the 3-1. I was expecting the whole story to be this the sort of roller coaster of how we get back to 1-1. And just right in the first couple paragraphs of the story, we're already back to 1-1. So I was like, okay, well, what is this story going to be about? Right. So it's like, we've done that. We're back to 1-1. What else is there? Then the masculine comes back in the form of the old man and says, this is great. 1-1, balanced everything. That's great. What we really need, right, is the water of life, the tree of beauty, and the magical bird. And basically that's like saying, you want a Tony, a Grammy, and an Oscar next. Or you want gold medals and all these different sort of Olympic events all at once. And it's like, okay, Grandpa, how are we going to do that, right? But that's the kind of thing that happens. When you have balance between the masculine and the feminine, everything's cranking, right? You start looking sort of to the beyond thing, to the next thing, which is beautiful. Right. I mean, you experience this in healing and bliss all the time. So you've healed all this stuff. I get these messages all the time. So Artie, I've done all this healing. I've really got my board of directors sort of reconciled. All these lost board members have come back. I'm like feeling great. And now I'm realizing that the life that I had built and, kind of projected, manifested all around me is kind of cracking and falling away. And it's upsetting because these are real relationships and real sort of professional careers and everything else. But this stuff is cracking and falling away because, I am, bigger than I was before, right? I'm different than what I was before. When I was smaller and wounded and in pain and afraid and shaming myself and everything, the world I built around me fit that just fine. And now as I'm like emerging, the shell of the egg is like cracking and falling down all around me. And after you go through that phase, there's a natural question from your own board of directors, if you will, your own inner sort of governors of your life, where they're like, what's next now? Right? Because in healing terms, when we talk about soothing and shielding, and when we talk about the things we do to make the wound better, right? So I shield with money, prestige, anger, keeping people away, people pleasing, placating people so they don't poke me. So all of these are roughly intended to shield from our wound getting poked. And then behind the shield, we soothe, right? Sex, substances, shopping, Netflix, food, right? All the usual suspects, right? So we shield to keep from getting additional injury, and then behind the shield, we numb. And, the $1 million question of healing is, well, what happens when we heal the wound itself, when we don't just numb it, right? What will happen is these soothing and shit like money, prestige, drinking, food, sex, relationships, numbing. These are the things that we like spend like 80 to 90% of our life energy on as sort of normal people in the world of the profane, right? And we need it to sort of take care of this wound that we have. But then what happens when the wound itself stops hurting because we have healed the thing that was causing the conflict? We have reconciled the issue within, right? Well, what happens is exactly what happens when your headache goes away. You stop taking aspirin, right? Nobody takes ibuprofen if they don't have sort of any headache or pain, because it's pointless, right? It's not pleasurable in and of itself. So when we heal our own inner wounds, all of our soothing and shielding behavior falls away. Relationships that were founded on the exchange of I give you this and you give me soothing and shielding start to crack and fall away if there's nothing else sort of holding it up. And I mean, the first thing is there's a lot of grief and pain that comes with that, right? Because we are human. These are real relationships. But then the other thing is that we are able to have this higher vision of what else we would do with our life energy. Now that you've healed a certain thing, all these things fall away. You go through the grief of going through all that. And then you emerge the other side. You realize if you're not gunning after money and prestige, and you're not gunning for soothing, sort of soothing, numbing relationships, emotional validation, food, not for the calories, but for the comfort. If you're not spending your time doing those things, you have a lot of excess time on your hands, right? Outside of the normal sort of just putting food on the table and a roof over your head, it's like it doesn't actually take that much just to do that, right? It's the other stuff that takes the extra sort of effort that is typically so much more difficult, right? Typically. And so the natural question arises, well, what am I going to do with all my free time? Right? What am I going to do with all this excess life energy? And it's circumambulatory. You'll go back and sort of numb and soothe and a couple rounds before you get to this distillated point where it's like, in terms of the story, the castle is fine, the church is fine. I don't need to dilly-dally around with that anymore. All of that is solid. I can do that in my sleep. What's the next thing? And the next thing is, water of life, tree of beauty, and the talking bird. And we can go into those symbols. We won't do that in today's session, but there was a session like probably a year plus ago where Gary pulled a story on, I think, like the most beautiful bird in the world. This son and daughter went out on this quest for this bird. And then they went into this like aviary where there were all these birds and they were trying to find the one true bird. And the trick, the sort of extra Hephaestian kind of skill they learned when they were going through grief was they learned to speak the language of the birds. Okay, so this talking bird motif is this ability to sort of relate and have back and forth with the world of the spiritual, which is what birds sort of represent. So it is something of this spiritual level, establishment of a new tree of life. This is the tree of, not of good and evil in the Garden of Eden, but the other tree in the Garden of Eden, which is in the Garden of Eden, which is the tree of eternal life, right? That was the tree that the God of Abraham, right, Yahweh, was afraid Adam and Eve would eat from after they'd eaten of the tree of good and evil. And they were like, okay, now that they've eaten from that, if they also eat of the tree of eternal life, then they will become like gods. And for whatever reason, we can't allow that to happen. And they were expelled from the Garden of Eden, right? That was sort of the deeper mechanics of what was happening there. So here in this story, you're pulling the branch from the tree of beauty, this tree of eternal life, basically, together with the bird and the water. And you're establishing a completely new tree, right? It's like you're building an entirely new kingdom, a new plane, a new realm. So anyway, so this progression of castle to church to this higher thing is pretty awesome, right? It's like, okay, this is what the story is about. How do I get it? I want it, right? It's very exciting. And so first off, right, the way you get there is through the feminine. So no surprise, right? It's the sister. So we've had all these stories where it's the three brothers and the last brother is the one to sort of pull the sword from the stone. Here, for this next level, right, 3 isn't enough. You have to recover the 4th, right? The one that finally gets you through is the sister. After the 3, the 4th. In terms of like the Christian Trinity, right? It's Father, Son, Holy Spirit, which is unbalanced because we know the self is a quaternity, not a trinity. So what is the missing 4th of the Christian Trinity? It's obviously Mary, or the devil, which, woman and devil, temptress are interchangeable, right? Sort of Madonna whore kind of thing. But no matter what face you use to look at the feminine, it's the 4th that's missing. And so, and we want to get into sort of, Christian physics here, but it's like Mary is the thing that redeems you in the end, right? There's no sort of, I think John Paul II was like a well-known sort of like fervent, zealous Marian worshiper of Mary. Yeah, it's all about Mary. I think as it must have been Alan Watts who said this. He was joking about these dynamics, and he was like, "Yeah, I mean, in the Christian system, everyone's like craving the woman because it's like a sky god. There is no goddess, right? There is no sort of soft mother." And I think he said, like, with just a wry sort of smile, it's like, "Yeah, no one longs for the bosom of Abraham." It's like there's no comfort to be had there at all, right? It's all sort of fire and brimstone and and punishment and shame. So here we're talking about the sister, the 4th sibling, that makes it all the way up. And so the thing that I zeroed into with the story is more around, so we know the prize, we know sort of the balanced one-to-one, masculine, feminine, that's all good. We've covered that in other stories. So the thing that was kind of uniquely interesting about this story, this Catalan version of the mechanics, to me was around the mechanics of ascension, right? Where you're in the middle of this transformation. What is the path of the transformation? And here it is both linear and circumambulatory, right? So it's circumambulatory is you're going up this mountain, right? And I imagine this sort of spiraling up the sides of the mountain like a ziggurat or something, right? So you're going up, it is circumambulatory, but it's also linear in the sense that you need to go forward only, you cannot look back, right? You cannot look back. And here, the interesting mechanics of moving forward and not looking back is that you cannot listen to the voices of the stones, right? And engage with them, which to me is a fascinating kind of detail of the story, one that we haven't seen in any of the past stories, really, right? So these stones are very interesting to me, and I want to come back to them, right? And it's so important. There's specific guidance on this, right? You're not stumbling around learning through trial and error. The giant flat out tells you what to do, right? And it is very, very precise. Okay. I mean, one interesting thing to note here, I've already said this in the beginning, is that in these in-between liminal spaces, right? The liminal is like in the threshold. So you're not here, you're not there, you're, betwixt and between two states in transformation. When you are in these liminal spaces, these phases of transformation in life, I will tell you, and the story reflects this, the guidance you are given by the muse, by the giant, tends to be very precise. Right? When you're going through a transformation and you're getting all these dreams left and right, the reason you're getting so many dreams is that they are giving you turn by turn GPS guidance on what to do. If you have eyes to see, if you have ears to hear, if you can read the dreams, But even if you don't have someone like me in your orbit to read dreams for you, right? What I tend to teach in the programs is like how you get the juice and guidance out of the dreams, even if you're not sort of as mythopoetically fluent, right? And ideally, you would do both. You would do both. So they tend to be very precise. And the giant specifically tells them, all you need to do, okay, chuckleheads, right? Like, these are the three boys, right? So it's like, hello, are you paying attention? This is ascension. This is the ultimate third phase. This is important. So don't look back. Do not pay heed to the scoffing and jeering voice of the bully inner critic within you. Keep moving forward. It's okay for you to hear them, but do not follow their guidance or be deterred or distracted by them. And that's it, right? Other than that, you will not get lost up the mountain. It's a labyrinth. It's a single track in and out. So go, come back. Do not turn around and do. That's all you. It's like, okay, you guys, you have one job. That's all you need to do. Okay. And they go through, and three of them, like 3 strikes, one after another, they all fail. Okay. This pattern of not looking back, we have seen it in other stories. So in the Orpheus story, which I think we did like probably exactly a year ago. I think like Gary has it here. We did it in March 2021. Hades tells Orpheus he can have his wife back if he leads her out of the underworld, but does not look back. And right on the threshold, right in the liminal space, right, where the guidance of Hades himself, so generously given, is going to matter, Orpheus looks back and he loses his wife forever. The masculine literally loses his feminine. You lose your vision. You lose your vision because you look back. In the Bible story of Lot's wife, when they're escaping, they are told to not look back, but she does look back, right? So it's not the Orpheus, it's not Lot himself looking back. She looks back, because this is an Abrahamic kind of sort of cultural narrative here. So it's always the woman's fault, right? It's a patriarchal kind of system. That's fine. So one way or another, you lose the feminine. But in this case, it's Lot's wife's fault. She does look back, and she turns into a pillar of salt, right? Which is mythopoetically so powerful. We don't have time to get into that here, but I'll just say very quickly, salt is symbolic of a wound and grief that has passed. So the ocean is a pool of tears, right? It's an ocean of tears. The salinity of seawater matches the salinity of human tears. Just mythopoetically, right? All that water out there, those are the depths of grief. That's why it's unexplored, because it's terrifying and painful. That's why you have to wait for the whale to come up and grab you and bring you down, right? Because no one in their right mind, before they have really become familiar with the undersea marinal kind of realm, marine realm, before you're familiar with that realm of grief, no one in the right mind would just like willingly go down, right? Unless they were getting very, very good guidance from a mentor they trust. And so anyway, after you boil the ocean of grief, what you are left with is crystalline salt. Okay. And the nature of salt, symbolically, is that it is a trace mineral that you don't need a lot of, but it also cannot be zero. Very similar to when in the bliss program, we talk about bliss, right? What is the right percentage bliss in your life? We leave that up to you. We don't prescribe any specific rule or guideline. There are things around 20% that become sort of tipping points that we warn you about. But more specifically, what we say is it can be whatever you want. It can be 3%. It can be 5%. It can be very low if you're like off doing all these other things that you have to do. But ideally, it is not zero. When your bliss is actually zero, then we get into trouble. And it's exactly the same with salt. If salt intake for you is zero, then you get into trouble. But you don't need a lot of it, right? So an old wound is like this. You've gone through grief. You've boiled the pots. You've done all the things you needed to do. And every now and then you come back to this salt lick to just lick it once, and that's all you need, right? So an old wound is a salt lick. And this Lot's wife of like turning back when you were not supposed to, she turns into a pillar of salt, right? Orpheus losing his wife. All of his music from then on was about this longing for his wife. So she becomes a salt lick, a salt pillar as well. Any wound that you have, you could almost say, to the extent you're like, well, I've done 30 years of therapy, I'm done with that, right? It's like when you say that, that is, I mean, I never say this to someone to their face. It's very awkward, right? But when anyone says, I'm done with it, I've done enough work, it's been 30 years, I should be past it and move on. It's like, ding, ding, ding. That's like the neon sign saying like, I don't know how many more years you have, but you're not done, right? Rather the sign that you know you're done. It's like, oh yeah, that, like whenever I look at it, it's very painful. I am vulnerable to the pain, right? This is a loved one lost. It's like, how would I ever fully get over it? And that is when it's become a salt lick, where you're not there hugging the pillar of salt, but it's like every now and then you get a bit of it and you taste the bitterness, right? And the bitterness is not shocking anymore. If anything, it's a trace mineral that you need. If you completely shut yourself off from that, then you get into trouble, right? Then you get into trouble. So in both of these cases, Orpheus and Lot, they look back. And what this then is, and again, none of this is bad. It's a punishment. It's like sulks, or it's just a description of some of the physics of how these processes work within us. The thing for me that jumps out is that the signal thing that causes both of these episodes to happen, and in this Catalan story of the stones, is a divergence and distraction of vision, right? Misplaced vision. You were told by the muse, by the giant, by God himself, by Hades himself, don't look back. Keep your vision focused on the goal. And that is the one thing you do. You divert your vision back. Okay. And again, it's not a punishment. It's just the physics, right? It's just the physics. And so to me, then, one of the things this story brings out is that the divergence of your vision and attention is equivalent to a loss of vision. Okay. You say, oh, that person has amazing vision. Yes, they may have the amazing potential for vision, but if they get distracted on all these other things, then they may as well not have vision. Right? If you have miraculous powers of vision and you close your eyes all the time, or you're like dealing with all these petty little things, then what's the difference between having vision and not having vision? If you don't use it, there's no difference. You may as well not have it. So when you have a vision for your life, whether you get distracted by a shiny thing or a scary thing or a shaming thing versus just going blind, there really is no functional, practical difference. Because when you lose that vision, you start stumbling. Okay, and you don't reach the ultimate sort of next thing. Net, right? If there's only one thing you take away from this story session, is that it's that distraction is the same as blindness, mythopoetically. Loss of higher vision is loss of higher vision, no matter what the details are of how it happens. Okay. And so here then, I want to move to the stones and tie them into this whole thing. Just turn this off here. I've lost my, okay. So the stones are brought back to life with the power of the water. So this is like the third step after the two previous stories. So the first story, the Kuda story, we're immersed in the pond of grief. Okay. And we recover with the water turns into the sake of like insight and illumination. Okay. And so here, to me, the wailing of the stones, the scoffing, the complaining, the jeering, is the grief of loss. Because what are the stones? They are literally our past failed attempts. Right? They are our past failed attempts. And the stones themselves make up the enormity of the mountain. What is a mountain but a pile of stones? So it takes, in a sense, because it's not just the three brothers, it's like every stone is a part of us. Every stone on the mountain is a totem to a failure that we have committed in our past. Okay. And you can make all of these arguments in terms of saying, well, it takes a lot of failure and circumambulation and failed attempts to even build the mountain, right, to the point where you even have ascension. Right? You could say, could I ascend without having any failure? It was like, well, no, because the physics just tell you if you had no failure, there would be no stones, there would be no mountain. Where everything's flat. Right? There is no mountain without failure. You build the mountain with your grief and your pain. So, and what the story is telling us is these multiple rounds of failing to not look back. Okay. This is normal. It's not a warning to say you better not look back. This is saying, we don't take the story as an allegory of like what not to do in the future. We take it as a symbol of how the life cycle happens, right? So in this story, we take the guidance that we will fail. We will look back. And that's okay. Everything turns out okay in the end, right? But the 3 rounds of failure and the countless rounds before that to even make the mountain, that is a part of the topography of our inner world. We will do this, right? And if you're like, well, how do I not do that? How do I avoid the mistakes that I did, or that my stupid brother-in-law did? How do I not be like him? How do I not be like these 3 guys? The minute you say that, you're already looking back, because you're looking back at the story of the 3 guys, and then, right, you're doing it. And I'm not saying try not to do that, right? I'm just saying that's what will happen. And it's like, it's okay. I mean, it has to be okay, because it's what will happen. I mean, the pro tip is like, after you do that for a while, you relax and you stop trying to do everything correctly and perfectly, and then you go straight up. Right? And then after I say that, you're like, well, can I sort of pretend that I don't care in order to go straight up? Well, that doesn't work. You're like the 3rd brother, and you still turn into stone. And again, that's okay. That will happen too. But after the 3 rounds, the completion of the cycle of the 3 rounds, in your life and my life, it may be a dozen, right? How many more people are you going to date like this before you finally like don't look back? Right? For some people, it's a lot, and that's okay. It's just, but 3 is a symbol of completion of the cycle. So however many times it takes to get to your 3 completes, the feminine, right, the source of nourishment and vision within you, steps in, goes all the way, and not only does she achieve, she comes back and recovers all the sort of, let's call them, the men and women, like a crowd of men and women, all the sort of life energies that have been locked up in the stones of grief from previous rounds. Right? So it all comes back and it all comes out in the wash in the end. But this is the process. This is the nature of the spin cycle that we all go through in order for this to happen. It is circumambulatory. It's not linear. Right? If you're like, how do I skip just to the sister phase where I go straight up? It's like, well, you don't. Right? You will fail. And you, in asking that question, have already turned into a stone. That's okay. And then, what's your next question? Let's keep going, because we're gonna keep going up. Okay. So, what is the thing that is different about the sister versus the brothers? In this fourth attempt, and this is just my own reading of it. In this fourth attempt, what does the feminine have that the masculine does not have? The feminine, typically, as we define these things, is the holder of vision. So there is something about her vision that is different from the masculine, from the brothers, that allows her to thread the needle and make it all the way through. What is the difference of this vision? Now, in the most elementary sense, as we said, distraction is equal to loss of vision, right? Well, the most basic thing she does is she doesn't get distracted. She keeps going. She doesn't look back, right? That's the most basic thing. But the more I read this, seeing the stones versus the mountain, right? It's like the forest is the mountain and the trees are the stones. So when they say you lose the forest for the trees, it's like you're just looking at the trees and you're not realizing the vastness of the forest you're in. You're looking at each individual stone. Oh, Artie's right. I'm always looking back. I don't understand stone. I want to find a way to sort of purify and get everything done right the first time so I can avoid all this pain. Stone. Oh my gosh, I did it again, didn't I? And like asking about purification. Stone. Right. And I'm like, fabulous. Good job. Keep going. Right. And then eventually that next level of vision will step in and you will be walking on the path of all these past stones to get to where you're going. And it's like, that sounds really painful and long. It's like, well, isn't that what we're all in the middle of anyway? Right? Whether we admit it or not. It's like, we're not saying, prepare yourself, this is what's going to happen. We're like, this is the soup you're already marinating in, and realizing it kind of helps you get through it faster in some way, right? Or, reduces the suffering because the narrative is different. You realize the archetype you're in and you realize, it's a labyrinth. It's not supposed to be a straight shot. So I don't need to like keep expecting and being disappointed that it's a straight shot. I realize it's twisty and windy. And when the next hairpin turn comes, I'm like, instead of going, oh my God, I'm a failure, you like throw your arms up in a roller coaster and you're like, hooray, right? So the feminine has a difference of vision. And the way I read this is that she is looking at the mountain, not at the stones. But the mountain and the stones are the same. A forest is trees. But she has a difference of vision. She is looking not at the stones, each individual stone on the ground and what they're saying. Right? She's looking at the overall shape of the mountain and the sort of meta path forward. And this is one of the things that happens when you finally emerge from a period of grief. Okay. One of the things that happens is that the quality and nature of your vision in life changes. Now, it's unique for each person how exactly it changes, but typically the track is that the vision changes in a kind of profound, almost unspeakable way. And I'll just give some examples. Don't take these as like the quintessential examples, but just take these as examples of how of what I mean when I say vision change. When you've lost a loved one, you realize in some visceral way they are still with you. Right? Like, we don't need to say like woo-woo spirituality, but even just mythopoetically within you, you find that lost loved one in you. Right? And there's a lot more I could say about that, but we'll just sort of, you realize that yes, you've lost the person on all these ways, and it's devastating. But the salt lick of that loss is that you feel them within you, even decades later, right? On a continuous day-to-day basis. Your vision has changed. Not your vision should change to that. I'm not saying this is how you should, right? Fear, threat, and control come out of a loss of a loved one. But often, if and when that does happen to a person over decades, that is the kind of thing we mean when we're like, okay, their vision has changed, right? Another example is when someone has had an ailment, sort of chronic ailment or life-threatening sort of disease or whatever. And whatever happened, they got out of it, it was cured, or, it wasn't, and this is something they're living with. And with some people in these situations, you will hear them say, not even in mixed company, but privately, they will say, I got to tell you, I hate to admit this, but it was the best damn thing that ever happened to me. Right? And they don't say this in mixed company and polite company, because in polite company, in the profane, it's like, how could that possibly be? Oh, she doesn't really mean that. She's just in shock. She's just trying to sort of overcompensate or whatever. But it's like in private moments with people they trust, between you, me, and the wall, I'll tell you, it's like, I don't know how else I would have had this change in me if it hadn't been for this like cancer diagnosis. Me looking back at myself 20 years ago, there was no other way you could have like hit me over the head and gotten me to see what I see now. And people who are in this position, they will say, I'm not happy it happened like this, but it's like seeing this, I understand why that was the choice that was made. And going even one step further, I'm glad because I'm glad it all happened, because I'm here where I am now. Okay. Even for me, speaking in hypotheticals, it's very uncomfortable for me to say those things, because it is speaking about a realm of vision that is completely different from the realm we typically inhabit in everyday life. It's like talking to a fish about air and saying you're in water, and the fish is like, what do you mean water? What are you talking about? And after a while, you don't talk about it anymore. What's the point of continuing to talk to a fish about like not water? But when you emerge from grief, the transformation will typically happen that your vision has changed. And what happens when your vision changes is that the world around you has not changed. Your way of seeing has changed. Because cancer is still cancer, right? The loss of a loved one, your loved one didn't come back, you still lost them. But it is the quality of your vision that has changed, and not through any conscious effort on your part. It's just after cooking, the substance has completely transformed. Okay. So it is a change in vision where you look at the mountain, not at the stones. And I'm trying to sort of get at it from different angles, but in the end, it is kind of this unspeakable distinction. It's really hard to put into words. So a couple more things on the story here, and I want to bring Gary back on screen. So we can talk about the blade, that's discernment versus the brute force of intellect. We don't need to talk about that. Let me skip around. Okay, so one thing to sort of note here is, how do I put this? So one of the things, I think I should talk a little bit about the blade. So the blade is given by the old man, and it is basically a mirror of the state of the masculine, right? It is the state of the brothers. It is a phallic object, so it symbolizes the masculine. Now, a blade or a sword, especially in Celtic tradition, is often a symbol of intellect and reason, right? Logos versus mythos. So logic versus mythopoetics. And not necessarily in a flattering light, right? A sword represents, a blade represents the hacking force of the intellect, where it's like, well, it's just, isn't it just logical? 2 and 2 is 4. The average of this pile of stones is this, but it doesn't tell you anything about the experience of picking up any one individual stone, right? So the hacking force of intellect reduces, abstracts into higher principle, into more sort of general principle, and you lose all this life and gooiness and moistness and texture. You lose reality in some sense in the process, right? In exchange for control. Because if I threaten you with a sword, you're going to do what I tell you, right? So it speaks to the brute forcing of vision versus the grace of vision. And you contrast this in Arthurian Celtic sort of tradition, the sword, right, versus the lance, right? In the Grail and the Fisher King, Parsifal, Gawain, Galahad, the quest for the Holy Grail, we distinguish between the sword and the lance. So the sword is the brute force hacking of intellect. The lance is more precise. It's more of a needle. So the lance is more a weapon of precision, of discernment, of judgment. I'm not hacking your arms and legs off, right? In a joust, I'm hitting your shield in exactly a certain way so that your shield shatters, you are unharmed, you're unhorsed, and then I can deal with you like chivalrously as a gentleman, right? That's the beauty of discernment. And so the sister looks to the blade, so she knows, right, whether the brothers have been transformed or not. And they are transformed when the blade turns red, as opposed to being its metallic sort of self, which is white. Okay. So, and this is why they failed, because they're all in the red zone. What I mean by this is in the masculine. So you can say this for men overall as well, but this is more the sort of masculine cycles of life within us. So your inner masculine within you, regardless of your outer gender, follows a cycle of a triplex of colors. And the sequence, the 3 colors are red, white, black. And the sequence is red first, white second, black the third. The feminine life cycle follows red, white, black as well, except the first 2 are flipped. It's white, then red, then black. I think there are sessions where I talk about this that are publicly available. But anyway, I'll just give you the thumbnail here. So for men, the first phase, red, is the red of blood spilled in battle. The red of the angry young man, right? The red of sort of, just bluster, warrior power, warrior feeling. The white is the white of a man in his middle-aged sort of prime. So if red is warrior, white is king, right? White is the white of the sun at high noon, where it casts no shadows and it's a brilliant white light. White is the white of semen, right? Of generativity, of true virility. So that's white. And then black is the black of sort of wisdom, of the third phase of life, of the wise elder, sage, Dumbledore, Gandalf, et cetera, in this sort of Obi-Wan, right? This black sort of sage phase. And so the inner masculine is in the red phase. And the feminine comes in and transforms right, through grief into a restoration of vision. Okay. And there's a function of in the masculine cycle where you don't see, I mean, she marries the prince who then becomes the king. So it's kind of hidden in there. But when I work with men, for instance, we will often discern between, what is the difference between a warrior and a king, right? A king presumably used to be a warrior, is still a warrior, still has his sword and can fight. What is the difference between a warrior and a king? It's not just power the king commands warriors, but why does the king command warriors? Right? And this is all within you, right? Your inner warrior, your inner king, regardless of your outer gender. One of the things that distinguishes a king from a regular warrior, and you can talk about this in male initiation, and part of the reason we don't, our world is a mess is because it's a patriarchy and we don't have kings, we have tyrants, which is like the weakened version of king that has been mythopoetically sort of castrated so they're not generative, right? And the signal difference, the thing that a king can do that a warrior cannot, is that a king has the power to bestow blessing. Okay. A king has the power to look upon something and say, without any sort of, deal or transaction trying to be offered, this is good. This is good. Okay. That is a power of vision. In the masculine cycle, literally when you go from warrior to king, the way a warrior acquires this vision is through grief. Right? It's grief that gives you this vision. The grief of loss in battle, the grief of pain and suffering gives you the vision that then marks you as a king. And so the title of the session is like healing grief, which hopefully we've talked a lot about, and that's been helpful. And the role of vision, what happens through the process of grief then is that you experience a change in vision. Okay. And so one of the things people often ask me is, how do I know when I'm done grieving? Okay. And there are a number of signals to tell when you are done grieving. But one of them is a change in vision. And two ways to think about that are at the end of a grieving process, because of a change in vision, you will experience, among other things, a feeling of gratitude and a feeling of blessing. Okay. So let's say, this classic image. Let's say a man has been in the middle of a messy divorce, right? A lot of grief, pain, gnashing of teeth, conflict, wounds being poked, vulnerabilities being sort of exposed. And at the end of it, divorce is final, everything's signed, everything's like done. This man gathers all his guy friends together at their favorite bar to celebrate the finalization of the divorce. And the first thing he does, he raises a glass, right, to toast. And the key signal of whether he has completed grieving or not is what he says in that toast. Does he says, oh, that so-and-so, that horrible woman, I'm so glad I'm rid of her. Finally, let's drink and get stupid tonight, right? Does he say that? Or does he say, I want to toast to my wife, right? I learned so much from her. I didn't end up deserving her, but she made me a better man, and I'm grateful to her, and I hope she has a great rest of her life. Gratitude and blessing. You don't hear about stories like that very often in our current profane society. Right? But that is an example and an illustration of the signal marker of when you have come out of grief. It's not that, oh, I should feel gratitude and blessing and I'm going to force myself, a la the wellness industrial complex, to forgive and feel grateful and feel blessed, so that I can get my food pellet of getting out of grief, right? That's not the mechanics we're talking about. We're talking about having gone through grief. Your vision, voluntarily or not, has undergone a change. And with the same eyes, you look upon the situation. And instead of stones, you see a mountain. And instead of curse, you see blessing. And instead of bitterness, you feel gratitude. All practically unwillingly, involuntarily, so it's just how you feel. That's one of the ways you know you have come out of grief. Okay. Okay, Gary, I've gone on way too long. Do you want to come up and more?
Hi, Artie.
Hi.
Thank
you. Thank you.
It was, I was reminded because you mentioned the bird of truth earlier, and that's a session we've done as well. As we were discussing this, one of the things that came to me was how the angle that we are looking at the symbols is different, right? So the bird of truth, and I've put the link on here, how to find your inner truth. That was a session we did, I think, in December 2020. And the focus there was entirely on the bird. And it's the same bird that we find in this story.
It's the same bird, yeah.
It's the same bird. It's a talking bird. And here the focus is just that, she finds it and brings it back and places it on the branch of the tree of beauty. And there's really not much talk about that bird, whereas the other story was all about the children in the story who make it their quest to go and find this bird, bring it back, and with the help of that bird, release the imprisoned queen, right, their mother.
Right.
So there is that aspect of recovering the inner feminine, the queen, from her imprisonment with the help of this bird, right? And here it is, and it's just like it's been reversed. You still have to get the bird, but it's the feminine who does it.
Right.
Because she's not imprisoned, so she does it. Where the initial rounds of circumambulation is done by the masculine.
Right.
So it's kind of a sort of a reversed mirror image. So
well, it is the brother and sister who got the bird back in the other story.
Yes. But the final steps where he has to go into the hall and amidst the cacophony, all the birds. And again, just like the stones who make noises here, we have all these colorful birds who actually make a lot of cacophonous noises.
And are trying to distract you.
And trying to distract you and prevent you from actually picking out the real bird, right? So we have the stones here that's making all these noises, trying to distract you from reaching the top of the mountain. So for me, it's really lovely that these dreams keep coming up again and again for us, trying to show different case studies, as you put it, right? You said, what if the feminine is imprisoned? Then this is the mechanics of what can happen. What if the feminine is not imprisoned, but there are all these the masculine and masculine versions who have to go through this labyrinth of cycles of grief. So this is what happens. So it's kind of a beautiful set of collections of lessons and case studies that we have. It's almost like you have to file through and go and look at, okay, well, what now? What does this symbol say? And what kind of event or dynamic am I looking at here?
Yeah, I love this because I think for me, it's like just listening to stories like this. I mean, this is good sort of practice for me too, where even listening to stories like this, whether you do the exercise or not, you start to get a horse sense for like the mechanics of it, right?
Yeah.
So it's not like, oh, this case you do this case you do that. But in my own experience, it's another case. So I guess I'm hopeless. I have nothing. It's like, no. It's like the skills you learn in these other cases all come to bear. So for instance, there's an aspect of the stones, right? Where every single stone is a past failure of yours.
Yeah.
And as you ascend, they're all yelling at you and jeering.
Right.
Right. And it's not that you plug your ears, right? You let them talk, but you continue moving forward anyway.
Right.
Because the meta pattern is that unbeknownst to the stones, because the stones didn't make it, if they knew, they would shut the hell up.
Yeah.
Unbeknownst to the stones, if they succeed in distracting you, they will not be rescued.
Yes.
Right? If they wanted to be rescued, they would shut the F up, let you do it, like the voice of the critic within you would stop self-sabotaging you, let you complete, and you come back with a pitcher of water and everyone would be free.
Yeah.
But they don't get that. I mean, if they got that, they wouldn't be stones in the first place.
Yeah.
So it's like, these are stones that are like annoying the hell out of me, and yet they're my brothers. I'm coming back for them later. And they're like spitting and like venoming and criticizing. It's like, oh, what do you think you can do? Look at this past thing. Look at that past thing. Like, how could you think you could ever be like smart enough or good enough to actually follow your bliss, right?
Right.
All of them pulling you down.
Yeah.
And with all of that, you need to look at them and say, in your mind, okay, those are all good points. I'm going to keep going anyway.
Yeah.
For your own good and their own good, because they are a part of you as well.
Yeah.
And so there is no like, I'm right, they're wrong. It's like your past mistakes will always haunt you. Your past wounds will always be this pillar of a salt lick or whatever. That will be with you. The whole point of recovering from grief is not that your pain goes away or the loss is undone. Like the whole point of when you emerge from grief is your vision has changed. It's like this loss is a part of you now. And instead of seeing it as like this gaping wound, you see it as like this, I don't know, this organ that is a part of your like inner ecosystem now. Not that it like makes you stronger or better. I mean, it often does. But for any of you who have suffered a loss, if you could like undo the loss and give up all the strength you gained from it, would you do that? You're like, yeah, absolutely. I would do that. I would do that in a heartbeat, right? Take some stones. The mountain's high enough, right? But when you come out of it, your vision has changed. Your relationship with the stones has changed. And in the bird story too, they're all trying to distract you with literally flashy, shiny things, right? I sing better. I look prettier. I'm scarier. Why do you want that like useless little bird hiding in the corner?
So this is interesting about the stones, right? Something came to me when you mentioned the stones. There's something about the texture of the stones and the texture of water itself that I think speaks to, again, the masculine feminine dynamic, but also of, freezing of life and then flowing of life. In that, when you say stones, it's when you turn into stone, you're basically freezing.
Yeah.
There is no movement. It's rigid. Right? And everything stops. You can still scream and rant and, laugh and mock and all of that, but you're just standing there still and you're frozen.
Yeah.
It's almost like ice is a stone.
Yeah.
Ice is water frozen, right? And then what makes them come alive is a sprinkling of water, which is fluid, which is moving. I mean, so much so that in this story, it's not even that she actively sprinkles the water at first. The water just flows out, falls out of the pitcher, right?
Yeah, the water knows what to do.
That's the quality of water. It doesn't stay still. It's always flowing, it's always moving. And the fluidity kind of speaks to the feminine nature of nourishment, feminine nature of life itself, right? So there's just so much of that. And there was something interesting I wanted to share with you, and it just came to me right now as we were talking about this, is that, this week when I was kind of doing some reflections with tarot cards, and then later the way I do it is just pick up a card and then let just that one thing come to me, and then I go back and write notes on it, whatever comes to me about that symbol. And one of the cards that came to me this week, and I wrote notes about it, was this thing of freezing, right? It was the card that's 5 of Pentacles. I don't have the card set here right now, but the 5 of Pentacles is basically the picture of this lovely window, right? Which looks like a church window. It's this glass kind of pattern.
I know it.
Right? And there's this woman, the man's almost kind of limping and is holding a stick and turning away from the window to the right. And then the woman they look destitute, right? They're walking in freezing snow outside, outdoors. And the church is right there. Like the church is, they could just look at the church and go in and find sanctuary, but they're kind of walking away from sanctuary. They're walking away from it, and they have this misery and cold and freezing. And the thing that came to me was, like you mentioned, about something about being distracted from vision, right? Like church is also a symbol for vision. And then getting distracted from vision is not something that happens passively. It's an active turning away. Right, which is also the kind of mechanics that we see here in the story. When they hear the brothers' voices, they actively turn around, even though they have the guidance that they should be they should keep going and keep looking at the mountain. That
it's a choice.
It's a choice. It's a choice, and that's one of the things that came to me. There's an active turning away that leads to impoverishment. It leads to sort of all this pain and misery. Not that it's wrong, because the church is right there anytime you choose to turn around. But the fact that it is an active state, not being open to insight, not being open to wisdom and guidance, is a choice.
I mean, this is why I'm such an almost I don't know, shameless advocate of following one's bliss. Right? Because you're like, oh, but I need to turn around because to deal with my brother, right? This failure of mine that is like fresh in my mind, right? And I'm like, turning around and talking to the stone that is your brother is not going to help your brother. Right? The way to help everything is to go all the way up and tap the fountain of your sake fountain of bliss or whatever, and that will come back and wash through everything. I mean, even if you were able to save your brother, what would you do? The next thing you would do is the two of you would continue questing up the mountain to find your bliss. Right? It's like, what is the point of a vine of tangled whatever if not for the flower to bloom, whether anybody sees it or not, whether anybody like says hooray and gives you prestige or not. Right? So it's like, if this is the ultimate thing, let's like get to it. And once the flower is bloomed, it's like everything else will be taken care of. Oh, the vine is being threatened. It's like, well, the seeds will be carried by the wind and we'll like put the the tree of beauty someplace else. It's like, for me, it's like, get to the bliss. It will come back, and it will just, I hate saying it this way because it sounds so, I don't know, rigid and rule-based, but the mechanics generally are that bliss will come back and take care of everything. I think even Joe Campbell had a quote like this where he was like, go to the, what is it he said? Go to the place of your joy, and it will wash all the pain away. And don't look back, not because you don't care, but because looking back is like how we got into the state of affairs in the first place. So let's try something different now, right? Let's try our bliss, and then see how that works.
Yeah, thank you for that. Do you want to ask the reflective question?
Okay.
Yeah, the exercise.
Yeah, let's do the exercise. Okay, so the exercise for this session, again, no expectation of participation, only if you want. It's just something to reflect on, to go deeper on your own if you'd like, is to think about a time in your life when you went through grief, right? When you went through grief, pain, suffering. You may be going through a period like this now. And the question is, how did your vision change as a result of that grieving? Did your vision change as a result of that grieving? Now, given everything we've said in the session, one could argue that if you feel like your vision did not change, the natural question is, did you actually grieve and finish grieving? It's just a question. It's not an indictment, right? It's not well, you need to go back. But that is kind of a bit of a litmus test to say, like, how did my vision change? And if it didn't, it's like, that's interesting. Why is that? Did it change and I didn't notice because it's been so long? And if you feel you didn't have a change in vision and you feel like this wound is still like dogging you, well, those will tend to go together, and you can kind of take steps from there, right? And so, one of the ways we've said to tell if you're done grieving from this story, one of the signs is a change in your vision. You see things that you didn't see before. You feel things you didn't feel before. You think things you didn't think before. And typically the thing that you see, that you feel, that you think that you didn't before, once you see it, you'll also realize it was there all along. It was there all along. And what changed was you, not the outer reality. Okay, so that's the exercise, only if you want. Okay, so our next session is next month after we get back from Europe. It's free, open to the public. Let me pop a link in here on Facebook and podcast. Feel free to join now. Invite your friends, only if you want. And for those of you who are in Europe, my travel plans have firmed up. I'm going to be in and around Athens about the last week of April. And I'll be in and around Paris around very early first week of May. And so if you're close to either of those two cities and you would like to get together, I think in each place, we'll probably have like a small gathering of folks in the area. No charge for these events. We're just going to sort of gather. It's been 2.5 years since I've really traveled overseas. And I would just love to see people and reconnect in person. Again, sort of virus conditions permitting. But yeah, if you'd like to do that, shoot me an email, let me know. And once we firm up the dates, I'll send out another email. Okay, so that's it for that. And we're a bit over time now. I apologize for that. And we'll go ahead and close the session. So I hereby close this session of our shared sacred space. Thank you for holding this space with me and with us. And thank you for sharing the nourishment, the emotional nourishment, and the spiritual nourishment of this shared sacred space with us. I give you my blessing. Go in peace, bestowed with blessing, free of fear, free of threat, and free of the undue control of others. Thank you so much. Happy Sunday. Have a great weekend and have a great month until our next session. Thank you.